When the name Standard Gauge Railway was spoken aloud for the first time in East Africa, it did not sound like the announcement of an ordinary rail line. It sounded like a promise of a new order. Politicians talked about a civilizational leap, engineers about a technological revolution, and the media about an Africa finally catching up with the world. In glossy renderings, you could see modern passenger trains, glass stations, and smiling travelers crossing the continent faster than ever before. But the real project was not born in the conference rooms of African ministries. It was born on logistics maps, where East Africa was drawn not as a family of states, but as a single elongated corridor running from the continent's interior to the Indian Ocean. The first working piece of that system appeared in Kenya. The Mombasa-Nairobi SGR was presented as national pride and a symbol of modernity. Officially, it would shorten travel between the port and the capital, make mobility easier, and ignite growth. In practice, it was engineered from day one as a high-capacity logistics pipeline, built to siphon containers out of Mombasa and push them inland. The construction was carried out by China Road and Bridge Corporation, a Chinese state-owned giant, and the financing came from China Exim Bank. The template was simple, repeatable, and brutally efficient. Beijing provides the loan, Chinese firms build the asset, Chinese technology becomes the standard, and the host state inherits the debt. When the line opened, passenger trains did indeed begin to run. They were fast, modern, and visually impressive, exactly the kind of image a government wants for billboards and campaign speeches. But alongside them emerged a facility that revealed more about the project's true purpose than any station ever could. The Naivasha Inland Container Depot, an inland dry port, became the gravitational center of the entire system. Freight trains converged there. Warehouses, transfer ramps, and customs infrastructure multiplied around it. It was the point where the story of rail for people ended, and the reality of rail for containers began. At the same time, a parallel story was unfolding to the north. The Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway, also built by Chinese consortia, became the model of an export corridor in rail form. Officially, it was a modernization project designed to accelerate Ethiopia's development. In practice, it functioned as an artery, moving goods from the interior straight to Red Sea ports. Passenger services existed, but their role was marginal compared to the mass movement of containers. Tanzania followed the same logic. Its new standard gauge line, linking Dar es Salaam with the country's interior, was sold as a national development venture. Yet, as in Kenya, the architecture was designed around heavy freight. Ports, transfer terminals, and logistics hubs grew faster than passenger infrastructure. The steel was laid with export in mind. In Rwanda and Uganda, the ambitions were more sweeping still. SGR extensions were meant to form a regional network, linking the interior to two ocean gateways. Strategic documents spoke of integration, but the underlying objective was clear: build a system capable of moving raw materials, agricultural outputs, and semi-processed goods at scale, faster than the old, slower routes ever allowed. Across the region, the same pattern repeated itself with almost clinical consistency. At conferences, officials showcased sleek passenger carriages. In technical blueprints, the dominating variables were freight capacity, axle load, and container throughput. Publicly, it was a railway for citizens. In reality, it was an export machine whose primary client was not the commuter, but the global market. That is why a strange and quietly revealing phenomenon appeared in parts of East Africa. Passenger coaches were sometimes attached to freight consists like a symbolic afterthought, one or two carriages of people trailing behind a long chain of containers filled with minerals, agricultural commodities, and export goods. The image became the metaphor. Officially, a railway for society. Practically, a railway for the world economy. China did not need to seize mines or plantations. It was enough to control movement. Whoever controls the rails controls the tempo of exports. Whoever controls terminals controls the direction of trade. Whoever finances infrastructure shapes the rules of the game. East Africa began to resemble a connected vessels system, in which each country functioned as a segment of a larger corridor. Kenya as the port gateway, Tanzania as the alternative ocean exit, Ethiopia as an industrial hinterland anchored to a single maritime lifeline, Uganda and Rwanda as future transit nodes, and above it all hovered the same financial and technological architecture, reproduced across borders with only minor variations. At this point, standard gauge railway stopped being a rail project. It became a civilizational project in a Chinese key, where infrastructure did not merely serve local development, but operated as a tool for restructuring the trade relationship between Africa and Asia. And this is where the real drama begins. Because East Africa had to answer a question it could not postpone forever. Does it want to become a space of social mobility, or will it be remade into the logistical spine of a global commodity system where trains primarily carry the continent's wealth outward rather than carrying prosperity inward? When Ethiopia announced a modern railway linking Addis Ababa to the Red Sea, the world read it as a symbol of African awakening. A landlocked state, cut off from its own ports after Eritrea's secession, would finally recover a window to the world. The official narrative promised expanding trade, citizen mobility, and industrialization. Renderings showed electric trains cutting through arid landscapes like proof that Africa had stepped into the 21st century. That announcement became the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, the first fully electrified standard-gauge corridor in East Africa. It was built by Chinese state consortia, China Railway Engineering Corporation and China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation, and financed primarily through China Exim Bank. Officially, it was rail for Ethiopians. In practice, from the first day, it was an export artery. Ethiopia needed the line not because citizens had to travel faster between cities, but because containers from factories, warehouses, and industrial parks had to reach Djibouti's port faster. More than 90% of Ethiopia's foreign trade flows through that single maritime outlet. The railway was not a communications luxury, it was an economic life support system. Once operations began, the hierarchy of priorities became obvious. Passenger services existed, but they were peripheral. What mattered were freight trains carrying containers, fuels, textiles, manufactured goods, and raw materials. Inland logistics nodes, dry ports like Majo, expanded faster than passenger stations. The real pulse of the infrastructure was not in ticket halls, but in container yards. The railway was marketed as a national project, yet its technical DNA told a different story. It was engineered for heavy loads, long freight consists, and intensive cargo utilization. Passenger schedules were subordinated to freight rhythms. People adjusted to logistics. Logistics did not adjust to people. For Ethiopia, it was the kind of transaction that reshapes a state for decades. On one side, the country gained a modern export corridor that helped increase trade volumes and attract foreign firms into industrial zones. On the other, it inherited a massive financial and technological burden. Operating the system required Chinese know-how, spare parts, and control technologies. Without external technical support, the line began to face operational stresses quickly. In effect, Ethiopia received infrastructure, but not full autonomy over its functioning. In the early years, Chinese operators were directly involved in management because local cadres were not yet trained to run such an advanced system. The railway could be formally owned by the Ethiopian state while remaining practically dependent on foreign technical capacity. Then the financial reality tightened its grip. Maintenance costs proved far higher than projected. Passenger revenues were symbolic compared to the budgetary needs of the project. The business model increasingly rested on freight, and the more the model depended on freight, the more the railway's logic bent toward export, toward the corridor, not the citizen. Ethiopia became a living laboratory of the Chinese infrastructure model. It demonstrated that a developing country could build a modern railway rapidly. It also demonstrated the price of that modernization, and that the price was not only financial, it was strategic. Because once the Addis Ababa-Djibouti line began operating, Ethiopia's economy became even more tightly bound to a single trade corridor, a single port, a single logistics system. Any disruption along that route could shake the entire state. The railway became the backbone of the economy and, simultaneously, its vulnerability point. In that sense, Ethiopia served as a warning for the rest of East Africa. It showed that standard gauge rail is not a neutral infrastructure investment. It is a geopolitical decision that locks a state into a particular trade model, a particular partner set, and a particular balance of power. That is why Ethiopia's experience echoed so strongly in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda. Each country faced the same question, phrased differently but ultimately identical. Do we want a railway that moves citizens, or a railway that moves the future of our exports? When Tanzania announced its own standard gauge railway, it was not merely an infrastructure decision. It was a strategic move designed to shift the balance of power in East Africa. In Dar es Salaam, officials spoke about national development, regional cohesion, faster transportation. In private, the language was different, capturing trade flows, weakening Kenya's position, constructing an alternative gateway to the Indian Ocean. For decades, Tanzania watched the port of Mombasa become the region's dominant exit point for Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Every container that passed through Kenya translated into revenue, political leverage, and logistical advantage. Dar es Salaam remained in Mombasa's shadow, despite having the geographic potential to absorb a substantial share of that flow. SGR was meant to change that. Built in stages from Dar es Salaam toward the interior, the new line was designed as a heavy freight corridor running toward Dodoma, onward toward Lake Victoria, and toward borders with Rwanda, Burundi, and the DRC. Officially, the imagery remained passenger-friendly. Sleek trains, modern stations, national pride. In reality, priority was given to container terminals, transfer hubs, and the ability to process massive export volumes. Construction was carried out by foreign consortia, including Chinese infrastructure firms, and financing relied on loans and public resources. Tanzania pursued a somewhat different posture than Kenya. Instead of one giant contract almost entirely anchored to Chinese lending, it segmented the project and tried to preserve greater control over debt structure. Yet the underlying character remained unchanged. The railway was engineered for heavy freight, minerals, agricultural commodities, fuels, and transit containers. Passenger services existed, but they served optics. Modern coaches helped demonstrate to the public that the country was moving forward. The true meaning of the investment revealed itself after dark, when long freight trains ran toward the port. Dar es Salaam itself began to be rebuilt for a new role. The port expanded, container terminals were upgraded, logistics systems were adapted to absorb flows from the continent's interior. Tanzania was not building rail for its own citizens alone. It was building a regional trade capture mechanism. Here, SGR stopped being a rail project and became a state rivalry instrument. Kenya watched with growing unease. Every new kilometer of track in Tanzania represented potential loss of transit through Mombasa. Uganda and Rwanda began weighing alternative export routes. The DRC, rich in copper and cobalt, saw Tanzania as a new gateway for its resources. The region began to reorganize. For China, this rivalry was almost ideal. Whether containers moved via Kenya or Tanzania, the infrastructure was built on broadly similar technical standards, often by the same companies, financed through comparable credit mechanisms. Regional competition did not weaken China's position, it multiplied it. Tanzania became the second pillar of East Africa's emerging rail empire. Ethiopia built a lifeline to one port. Tanzania built an alternative trade map meant to attract flows from across the Great Lakes region. Social tensions followed. Communities along the line noticed that the railway did not solve their daily mobility problems. Trains did not stop where people needed them. Timetables obeyed logistics, not social rhythms. The railway was physically present, yet psychologically foreign. Tanzania gained a geopolitical instrument and began paying a social price for infrastructure designed around trade interests more than citizen needs. And here, Tanzania's story folds back into Kenya, Ethiopia, and the future plans of Uganda and Rwanda. Because East Africa was no longer a patchwork of states, it was becoming a battleground for logistics corridors. When Kenya announced standard gauge railway, the narrative bordered on messianic. Politicians called it the largest infrastructure project since independence. Media circulated futuristic station renderings, sleek passenger trains, crowds boarding like witnesses to a new era. Nairobi wanted to believe the country would stop being merely a colonial transit corridor and become the region's modern transport hub. From the beginning, the project carried a second layer. The first segment, Mombasa to Nairobi, linked the Indian Ocean port to the capital. Officially, it would move people faster and cheaper. Unofficially, its main function was to extract containers from Mombasa and push them inland before they clogged roads, traffic, and outdated rail lines. China Road and Bridge Corporation built it. China Exim Bank financed it. The formula was fast, functional, and stark. Financing from Beijing, execution from Beijing, technology from Beijing, debt remaining in Nairobi. When the first trains ran, Kenya celebrated. Passenger coaches were air-conditioned, clean, modern. Travel time collapsed. Politicians cut ribbons. Cameras broadcast inaugurations. For a moment, society believed the railway had been built for them. But a second world was forming in parallel. Hundreds of kilometers inland, on open savanna, a massive logistics node rose, Naivasha Inland Container Depot. Officially, a dry port meant to relieve Mombasa. In practice, it became the system's center of gravity. Freight trains converged there. Containers accumulated. Decisions about onward transit toward Uganda, Rwanda, and the DRC concentrated there. From that point on, the truth became difficult to deny. Kenya's SGR was not a passenger railway with freight capacity. It was a freight railway with a passenger add-on. Subsequent decisions confirmed it. Kenya's government administratively pushed a portion of container transport from road onto rail, effectively forcing logistics firms to use SGR, officially protecting roads and the environment. In practice, ensuring the cash flow necessary to service the railway's debt, because the core problem emerged. Construction costs proved far higher than advertised, and passenger revenues were negligible compared to budget needs. The railway was not earning its way. It began to exist in order to service its own indebtedness. In Nairobi, murmurs began around risk and critical infrastructure. Media scrutinized loan terms and the strength of lender protections. Public debate intensified over whether the port of Mombasa had become entangled in the project's financial architecture in ways the country could not easily unwind. Kenya attempted to extend SGR toward the Ugandan border, aiming for a full regional corridor. But later stages stalled. Financing became uncertain. China grew more cautious. What had been framed as expansion started to look like a system bogging down under its own weight. Kenya realized it was no longer merely a recipient of infrastructure. It was a participant in a geopolitical contest where rail functions as leverage, not merely transportation. Then Tanzania's SGR accelerated, offering an alternative corridor. Uganda began to consider different routes. Kenya's presumed monopoly began to erode. The railway that was meant to make Kenya the uncontested regional leader began to behave like a heavy machine requiring constant feeding, even as the region diversified away from it. For ordinary Kenyans, SGR became a paradox. Modern and fast, yet also a symbol of debt, foreign contracting, and decisions made beyond social control. Passenger trains moved by day, freight dominated by night, and the bills arrived every month. Kenya became the region's cautionary tale. Infrastructure can be visually spectacular while functioning as a long-term fiscal anchor that binds a state for decades. That is why other East African governments studied Kenya's SGR not only as a template, but as a warning. Mozambique offers the starkest contrast, because there, rail was never sold as a romantic symbol of modern mobility. The narrative was blunt from the start. Once enormous coal reserves were discovered in Tete and massive offshore gas fields were confirmed along the Indian Ocean, the country's priority became obvious: a fast, cheap, large-scale export system. That urgency produced a new generation of rail corridors linking extraction zones to export ports. The most important became the Nacala Corridor, running from mining regions through Malawi to the deepwater port of Nacala. This line was not designed for daily commuting. It was engineered for coal trains pulling thousands of tons per trip. In parallel, the Beira Corridor developed as a route linking inland Mozambique and neighboring countries to the port of Beira. It became a key export artery for Zimbabwe and Zambia, turning Mozambique into a transit gateway for much of southern Africa. This is where China entered the structure. Chinese infrastructure and logistics firms became involved in port modernization, terminal development, and rail-linked upgrades. These investments were not packaged as social projects. They were framed as economic development, which in practice meant one thing: maximizing commodity exports. Maputo Port became another node. Quays were modernized, channels dredged, container and bulk terminals expanded, rail served the port served the global market, and the global market increasingly revolved around Asian demand. Mozambique learned quickly that rail does not deliver neutral modernization. It can deliver export dependence. The economy began to pivot around commodities, and the rail network's design was shaped overwhelmingly by extractive and energy needs. Passenger services existed, but they were marginal. The tracks belonged to coal, gas, and containers. Communities watched trains pass through without stopping. Rail was physically present, yet socially distant. For China, Mozambique was a textbook case: immense resources, weak infrastructure, urgent need for capital. No elaborate political narrative was required, only export figures and growth projections. The result was a model in which Mozambique became logistical hinterland for Asian energy and resource systems. The railway did not connect people. It connected mines to ports. It connected the interior to global demand. But the model produced its own fragility. When commodity prices fell, the budget felt it immediately. When exports slowed, corridor economics deteriorated. A country that invested in export infrastructure became hostage to global commodity cycles. Mozambique thus became one of the clearest illustrations of what the Chinese infrastructure model often becomes in practice: not rail for society, but rail for resource flow. And that is why Mozambique's story started to circulate in Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, and Addis Ababa, not as a curiosity, but as a preview. Mozambique built the tracks, but Mozambique was not the primary beneficiary of where those tracks ultimately led.